Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 261, 1905, the season that made a nation. Rugby in Wales is, of course, the national sport, something that's been discussed many times over the years. It's debated, of course. People go back and forth as to whether there are better options than rugby, but if we're honest, we would have to say that it's definitely the sport that for a number of years, many Welsh people felt a lot of pride in and watched religiously. And current struggles aside, has been a sport that when you go to Wales, you know about pretty quickly, just simply because it's everywhere. Even when you go into the shops, like I did a month or so ago, you still saw rugby-related stuff before you saw football-related stuff, something I think is kind of indicative of that. Even the knockoff clothes are still linked to rugby-related appearances rather than football-related appearances. So even with the success of the current version of the Welsh football team, there's still a undercurrent that rugby is important. And of course, obviously nationally and internationally, the teams within the Six Nations and the 4 teams that represent the regions of Wales have been struggling. There's no doubt about that. Yet the history of Welsh rugby shows just how integral it had become for many people over so many years. Today we're going to talk about its foundations, how it led to one of the magnificent year of 1905, and why that year is considered so important for Welsh rugby. By the end of 1905, Wales had defeated the greatest touring side in the world and introduced what is widely regarded as the first pre-match national anthem in international sport, and cemented rugby as the emotional core of modern Welsh identity. By the early 20th century, rugby was not simply popular in Wales, it was an emotional infrastructure. It was civic ritual. It was an arena in which a small nation without political sovereignty could stand shoulder to shoulder with the powers of the British Isles and beyond. Yet rugby was not born in Wales. It was imported, adapted, and argued over and reshaped by the industrial society that made up modern Welsh thought. Its rise parallels the transformation of Wales itself in the 19th century from the rural margins to the industrial powerhouse that it becomes at the beginning of the 20th century. Today, we trace rugby's journey from its English codification to its Welsh golden age before the First World War. We will examine not only the matches and the players, but also the social conditions that made rugby the national game of South Wales. Something to keep in mind, and I think it's important to understand, is that there is a bit of a divide between North and South Wales as to the sport that people are following and people understand and have relationships with. The rise of rugby in South Wales, which of course is the more populous area, so of course that's the reason why it is so popular in Wales, doesn't match up with North Wales, especially Northeast, where football coming out of Wrexham and the surrounding area has become incredibly popular. Yes, teams rise up in Newport and Swansea and Cardiff and other places, Merthyr, but by comparison to the rugby rise, it's not on the same level. It's not even close. Now, rugby's mythic origins at the rugby school with William Webb Ellis provide the sport with a romantic birth story. However, historians such as Tony Collins stress that football codes eventually evolved gradually over the 19th century across British schools. As I mentioned in the previous discussion when I was talking about football's codification, there were 2 competing ideas about how football was to be played. One becomes the English Football Association's rules, and the other becomes what we call the rugby rules, and how they split up eventually into Rugby Union, into Rugby League, into various forms of football in North America and Australia. All of these things kind of cycle out from this dispute from the 2 sides and how things were codified. This, of course, is key in how it gets founded. The key development was institutional. In 1871, the formation of the Rugby Football Union created a unique rule structure. The RFU defended strict amateurism, defining rugby union as a gentleman's game. Interesting, as we know going forward, this will change. This mattered enormously later in Wales. The ideology of amateurism was rooted in the English public school values. Yet, in Wales, the sport would become embedded in the working class communities, and that tension would shape Welsh rugby identity for years to come. As the English paper The Sunday Special in 1899 would put it, quote, "The Welshmen have done splendid work in making rugby football popular, even if they did obtain the system from the West of England clubs." End quote. To understand rugby's success in Wales, we must understand industrialization and how that drove the focus of people in sport. Between 1850 and 1913, South Wales became one of the most densely industrialized regions in the world. Coal output expanded dramatically, and ironworks and docks reshaped landscapes. Towns like Cardiff and Newport grew at astonishing rates. Industrial labor required discipline, cooperation, and physical resilience. Rugby, of course, mirrored these qualities. Unlike cricket, also very popular in South Wales, which required time, space, and equipment, rugby was accessible. You only needed a ball and a field, and willing bodies were enough. Something that we can look at with football, which kind of explains how that sport grew as into a worldwide sport. But accessibility alone doesn't explain emotional investment. Rugby matched the ethos of nonconformist chapel culture. Chapel promoted sobriety, organization, collective singing, and moral seriousness. Rugby clubs often emerged from or were closely linked to chapel networks. Something that to consider is that in some of the conversations we talked about in the last episode, that the idea of temperance being built up by these churches also drives this idea to move into more organized situations like sports. Gareth Williams argues that rugby provided industrial communities with a respectable outlet for masculine competition. It allowed communities to channel aggression into structured form. In other words, to get them away from the drinking culture and the violence that came from that. In towns across Glamorgan and Monmouthshire, rugby clubs became civic institutions. Victories were not merely sporting achievements, they were communal triumphs. On March 12, 1881, representatives gathered at the Castle Hotel in Neath to form what became the Welsh Rugby Union. This act was more than administrative, it formalized Welsh sporting nationhood. Wales played its first international against England later that year, suffering a crushing defeat, yet participation mattered more than victory. Wales was now a part of the international rugby community, and with it came the establishment of localized clubs, and as you'll see, they are all situated in the southern part of Wales. Early leading clubs included Neath, Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, and Llanelli RFCs, or rugby football clubs. These clubs were embedded in their town structures. Industrialists, tradesmen, dock workers, and professionals all participated. Keeping in mind that up until now, rugby had been kind of the playground of the schoolboys and the public schools in England, had been sort of the idea of the upper class rules, and now all of a sudden was merging into the more industrial and worker classes in Wales, which was changing the dynamic quite dramatically. If we're going to talk about that, we also need to talk about how things were changing and how it was spreading. By the late 1880s, rugby was not just simply spreading in South Wales, it was becoming dominant. It was the sport in South Wales, and all of this then drove a lot of questions about how exactly the sport should be looked at. No early Welsh player symbolized the rise of the sport more than Arthur Gould. Playing for Newport and captaining Wales, Gould was skillful, tactically intelligent, and charismatic. He became one of the first rugby celebrities. In 1896, supporters raised funds in recognition of his contribution. The English-dominated international board viewed this as professionalism. How dare they? And Wales was suspended temporarily over this issue. This controversy exposed a deeper issue. Welsh rugby was embedded in the working class communities, where financial realities differed sharply from the English public school traditions. In other words, the idea of having a purely amateur sport wasn't viable for a lot of people who were living day to day. Then, if it's just a hobby, you're not going to put in the effort needed to become good at it. While rugby leagues split from Union in Northern England in 1895 over this professionalism, Wales remained within the Union, but this tension over this never, ever went away, and that's something to keep in mind. There will eventually come a point, many, many, many years later, almost 100 years later, in fact, where professionalism finally is established in rugby union and this debate ends. But until we get there, that's going to be an ongoing discussion. Now, Welsh rugby's rise was not accidental, of course, it was strategic. By the 1880s and 90s, Welsh clubs developed the 4-3-quarter system, which emphasized, and this is going to be very technical, and I'll try not to do too much of this, but it is important to understand how Wales not only took on rugby, but evolved rugby. So let me just step back and we'll start this process. Welsh clubs had developed the 4-3-quarter system, which emphasized the backline's movement and passing. Speed and evasion replaced pure forward weight. In other words, rugby was a very different animal in the early days versus what it becomes as it gets to be a much more thought about and pragmatic sport in which the ideas of creating formations and tools and tactics now are much more important. This style, of course, suited the physiques and training of many Welsh players. It also aligned with the values of creativity and collective interplay. The Welsh style would influence the international game, and it demonstrated the tactical intelligence could overcome the size. In fact, the idea that you'd be able to spend a lot of time training to become a rugby player specifically just wasn't in that capability, especially with it being an amateur sport. I would argue that most even professional sports at this time, no one's paid enough to become strictly a professional player. So there isn't, you're still doing jobs in the week and then going and playing rugby and maybe practicing a little bit just before you go out and play. So it's a much different type of environment. So when you can get ways of finding methods and tactics to use that help you, especially when you're on the smaller or less physical brand of rugby, then you want to have these kind of things to help with that. By 1905, Welsh rugby was already in a strong position. The Welsh Rugby Union had been operating for nearly a quarter of a century at this point, and Wales had won championships and developed a distinct style of play built around speed, passing, and tactical intelligence. The captain of the 1905 team was Gwyn Nichols, nicknamed Prince of Three Quarters. Calm, strategic, and respected across the home nations, Nichols embodied the maturity of Welsh rugby. Alongside him stood other key players such as Billy True, Rhys Gabe, Dickie Owen, and Cliff Pritchard. These were not amateurs in spirit, even if they were technically amateurs in status. Many were working men. They trained hard, and they analyzed their opposition, and they refined tactics carefully in planning for that opposition. The season of 1905 began routinely enough with home nation fixtures, but in the autumn, news began to dominate headlines. A team from New Zealand was coming to the Four Nations, as they were then would have been known as. The touring side was the New Zealand National Rugby Union team, later nicknamed the Originals. They had already dismantled England and Scottish opposition. Their style was powerful, disciplined, and tactically advanced. They introduced structured backplay and conditioning that impressed observers. They were also performing the haka before matches, which astonished British crowds unfamiliar with such ritual displays. Anybody who's watched New Zealand play rugby knows what the haka is, but just in case you don't, it's a Maori war dance, effectively, in which, and I apologize if pronunciations are not great, in which, as part of it, my understanding, understand that I don't have full knowledge of it, but my understanding is that you're supposed to be making these brave faces to show, your willingness to fight, and it's about that idea, that combined willingness to take on the other side. So you make crazy faces and loud noises and shouting, and then they do a ritualized dance as a part of it. And that probably is very, very poorly explained, but just as kind of an aside, so if you're not familiar, and you can imagine if you've never seen this before and it comes up. I know the first time I saw it, I was blown away by it because it was so intimidating looking. And the one thing now, of course, is the players on the other side typically just stand stone-faced staring at them while they're doing it, rather than doing something back or trying to, become aggressive in their motions. They typically just stand there and put up with it. And you can imagine most players, never knowing this is coming, would have been quite shocked by it. And what it did, though, was it definitely drove the energy of the audience. And that there were people watching, that there's audiences for this, that standard stadiums and seating and all those kind of things still are not there yet. So, but the crowds were growing. Historian Hugh Richards noted that anticipation was reaching a fevered pitch and tickets were scarce, and Cardiff was transformed because of this game. What made 1905 different, of course, was the preparation. The Welsh selectors and players studied New Zealand's previous matches carefully. They noted the All Blacks, the actual nickname for New Zealand's team, forward dominance, and defensive organization. The Welsh response was strategic. Rather than matching brute strength directly, Wales aimed to disrupt the rhythm and exploit space. Scrum half Dickie Owen was central to this plan. His quick distribution could unsettle heavier forwards. Centers such as Nichols and True would aim to stretch the play wide. In other words, as you space people out on either side, it gives you an opportunity to move the ball quicker because there's less people to oppose you on that side. Again, I'm not going to break down rugby rules. I am not the person to talk about rugby rules. I don't know them well myself beyond a certain degree from watching them over the years. But you see this in the modern game. Teams will try and stretch themselves as they're trying to pass it so that they can get it from the clump of players standing in one side of the field to get it towards the other side where there's an opening for your fast people to run and try and get out and break out to get towards the try or the touchdown, if you want to use North American explanations. And that mass of movement would be very quick and has to be by nature abrupt. And so you can see why that kind of thinking and planning would definitely have broken down structures and formations that were not ready for it. Training intensified in the weeks leading up to the 16th of December match. Though amateur by official classification, the Welsh players approached the match with a modern level of seriousness and planning. The crowd at Cardiff's Arms Park exceeded 40,000. Thousands more gathered outside the grounds. And before kickoff, the All Blacks performed their traditional haka. In response, the Welsh crowds began singing the national anthem. Fascinating to see that dynamic change. And I will say, having been to rugby matches where the national anthem is being played, it is, in its own way, a startling experience because it's not like frequently you go to games, and especially in North America where they play the national anthem before every game for some reason. Not everybody sings. It's not always as emotional. But in these international situations, especially with Wales, the singing is triumphant and it's overwhelming and it can be quite loud. And so in a way, it's its own version of the haka in intimidating the other side. Again, 100 years later, not as much. But back then, I'm sure that was quite a surprise. This moment is widely regarded as the first occasion in which the national anthem was sung before an international sporting event. The symbolism was powerful. Rugby had become the theater of nationhood. And, of course, Like all rugby matches, this match itself was brutal and tactical. New Zealand pressed early, dominating territory. Their wing, Bobby Deans, believed he had scored a try before the first half, claiming to have grounded the ball over the line before being tackled. The referee disagreed, and no try was awarded. In rugby, for those who might not know, in order to score a try, similar to a touchdown, you have to physically place the ball in the end zone on the ground. You can't simply cross the line. That's not enough. And if you can't do that, if you get tackled or you lose possession of the ball, then that try fails. Welsh accounts, of course, celebrated the heroic defense. New Zealand sources long maintained that Dean had indeed scored, and the controversy remained a part of rugby folklore for years. Decisive moment, however, came when Teddy Morgan crossed for a try, converted under the scoring system to give Wales a 3-0 lead. Scoring system at that point is very different than it is today. Today you get more for a try than you do for a kick, and I'm struggling to remember what the actual the extra kick is. I'm just coming back to football phrases, so I will try not to do that. But it's now it's worth a combined points if you do both. But at that point, it was only worth 3, no different. So interesting little situation when it comes to those kind of things. Wales defended resolutely for the remainder of the match, and the final score of the game was Wales 3 and New Zealand 0. It was the All Blacks' only defeat on the tour, and it set in motion an understanding that Wales was a rugby power. The Welsh press erupted in celebration. Newspapers framed the victory as a national vindication. Industrial communities treated the win as a communal triumph. Church sermons even referenced the match. Civic reception honored players in ways that obviously would be of huge importance. They would be national celebrities. The symbolism mattered as much as a result. In an area when Wales lacked political autonomy, rugby provided an international representation. Historian Gareth Williams argues that the 1905 victory marked the high point of rugby as a vehicle of Welsh culture confidence before the First World War. The All Blacks match overshadowed other fixtures, but the season as a whole, 1905, reinforced Welsh strength. Clubs matches across South Wales drew enormous crowds. Rivalries between Cardiff RFC and Newport intensified. Swansea remained tactically innovative and important. The WRU capitalized on growing interest, gate receipts increased, and infrastructure improved. Players became public figures beyond their towns. Billy True and Gwyn Nichols, for example, were nationally recognized. And in 1905, this season was not just about the single match. It was considered the consolidation of Welsh's rugby maturity. The 1905 victory shaped Welsh sporting mythology permanently. It established the idea of the anthem tradition, the image of Wales as tactically superior underdog, the narrative of industrial resilience, and Cardiff Arms Park as the national stage for rugby. It also influenced global rugby culture. The haka, of course, became entrenched in pre-match rituals. The idea of rugby as an expression of national identity intensified worldwide, especially in an era when rugby was largely played amongst various British imperial possessions and nations. So therefore, there would be that link as well. And this golden era continued throughout the Grand Slams of 1908 and 1911. But 1905 remained a defining year for Wales and put it on a brink of a large amount of change in the sport. Within a decade, of course, Europe would be involved into World War I. Many players of this generation actually enlisted, and of course, some would not return. And this idea of innocence and cohesion of Edwardian rugby culture would fracture. Yet the memory of 1905 endured, becoming a benchmark for future generations. Even today, discussions of Welsh rugby greatness inevitably return to that December afternoon. It makes a line for people to think about. In a way, if I was to compare it to my own experience, it's growing up with a version of Well, if you're American, the Miracle on Ice in hockey, where people remember how the U.S. won a gold medal in 1980. If you were a Canadian, a big marker for a lot of my generation was the Summit Series between the Soviets and the Canadians, wherein they played 8 games and Canada won the series, and it became both a note of pride, but also something that stands out even today, to the point where quite a number of people who were alive during that period can tell you where they watched it, because they were watching it in schools and everywhere else. And so you have these times in the history of nations where sport stands out for people, where it becomes a central thing that people remember, and it does act as a way to bring people together. And no doubt that was no different in Wales. It always was more than just a score line. It was always more than just playing a game. It was about creating national unity, in creating something that would be remembered and would bring back a lot of traditions that still outlast that particular year. It's something I think that's incredibly fascinating to talk about, incredibly fascinating to kind of get your grips around. There are better places to go if you want to learn rugby, or if you want to watch rugby, and I would recommend it if you've never seen or heard anything about it, especially if you have a background in American football, because rugby players are joining American football quite a lot these days, especially Australian rugby football players. And I think it's a good way to understand where the sports come from and how it was played before it became this thing that is currently in North America now under the National Football League or the Canadian Football League and their various college derivatives. That's something that you can take out of this podcast and go your own way with, but it's something to think about. I always look at it and think highly of how these kind of things come about, because when you go back and look at the history of these sports, so much changes, so much grows out of them, which you can't understand necessarily if you haven't experienced it. And I definitely recommend, if you have an opportunity to go to a game, even if you don't know the rules, go. The thing I found with fans of rugby is they're delighted to help you out if you don't understand it. And I think that's one of the real delightful things about it, is that people are willing to help you and they're willing to let you know how it works. So if you're not something you know, definitely take part, definitely have a watch. And, the Six Nations has passed by, but there will soon be internationals, and we'll gear up for the next autumn where things will pick up again. And certainly there's a lot of things going on in Welsh rugby right now, which are very important to the existence of it. So that also is going to be a thing. So with all that said and done, thank you once again for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always catch me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out to me at most social media at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook. It's slightly different at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. As well, we do have a Patreon. Certainly any help in that regard would be wonderful. And you can do that through patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all for listening or viewing today. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.